Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Ferguson Library. The Ferguson Library was once again awarded NEA's Big Read, and this year our selection is none other than Beloved by Toni Morrison. I hope many of you have gotten a copy and delved into her work or have starting to delve into this work of great literary, social, and emotional magnitude. If we have flyers in the back that list all of our programs for Big Read, Dr. Valerie Smith is our keynote speaker, but we have a speaker every week, and we are closing off our Big Read celebration with none other than Farah Jasmine Griffin. So please come to all of our events. When Toni Morrison was an editor at Random House, she edited an anthology titled The Black Book. While working on this book, she came across an article about a woman named Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner was a runaway slave who killed her children in order to prevent them from being recaptured and resold into slavery. That was the article that inspired Toni Morrison to write Beloved, a story set at the end of the Civil War depicting maternal love, the choices and sacrifices she must make in order to save her children from physical and emotional bondage. Today is a special day, not just because of our speaker, Dr. Valerie Smith, but also in the history of Beloved. It was exactly on this day, October 7th in 1993, that it was announced that Toni Morrison was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. So yay for October 7th. Joining us this evening to talk about Beloved, Toni Morrison, and all of her literary gifts is Dr. Valerie Smith. Dr. Smith is a distinguished scholar of African-American literature and currently the 15th president of Swarthmore College, where her priorities have included attracting more low-income and first-generation students, supporting curricular innovation, increasing the diversity of the student body, and strengthening the relationships between the college and the region. In addition, Dr. Smith is a member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, the Council on Foreign Relations, and serves on the board of the American Council on Education, the Consortium on Financing Higher Education, Fulbright Canada, and the National Museum of American Indian. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Bates College, she earned an MA and PhD degrees at the University of Virginia. Prior to her arrival at Swarthmore, she was a professor of English and African American Studies at UCLA and the Woodrow Wilson Professor of Literature, founding director of the Center for African American Studies, and the dean of the college at Princeton University. She is the author of numerous articles and 3 books. In particular is Toni Morrison, Writing the Moral Imagination. And now, without any further delay and with great honor, we welcome to the podium Dr. Valerie Smith.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you all, and I'm very grateful to you for making time to be here. I've been saying to people, it's been a long time since I've been out in public, so I'm still trying to figure out how you actually act around people. I don't know if anybody has that that same experience. Also, I'd like to begin by thanking Elizabeth and the staff and friends of the Ferguson Library for inviting me to participate in this series. And I'm so delighted to have members of the extended Swarthmore family here this evening as well. So thank you to my alums and Swarthmore parent for being here, and anybody else who may have the Swarthmore connection who hasn't identified themselves to me yet. So as Elizabeth indicated in her introduction, I began my career as a scholar and professor of African American literature and culture. Since July 2015, however, I've been president of Swarthmore College. In my work as a college president, I focus on supporting our institutional commitment to teaching, learning, and working in an academic community. But I no longer have much time to devote myself to teaching and writing. So I am really grateful to you all for offering me this opportunity to re-immerse myself in Morrison's work and to share with you some thoughts about my journey through her writing. So I was introduced to Toni Morrison's fiction in the late 1970s. A friend recommended that I read Song of Solomon, which was published in 1977, and I was blown away by it. I remember coming upon passages that were so elegant that I had to pause and read them out loud to myself. I remember being captivated by the characters. Pilate, born without a navel, a woman named First Corinthians, and guitar. Does he fly or does he die at the end of the novel? I also recall being struck by her use of details that initially seemed implausible, supernatural even, but over time became more plausible than so-called real life. So as soon as I finished reading Song of Solomon, I went on to read her first two books, The Bluest Eye and Sula. And after that, I became a fan for life. Yes. So I'm taller than I look on Zoom, right? Thank you. All right, thank you. In the 1980s, I regularly taught Morrison's work in a variety of courses, ranging from African American women's writing to survey courses of US literature generally, and survey courses of African American literature in particular. In those classes, many, if not most of my students had never read any of Morrison's work, and some had never even heard of her. Again, this was in the 80s. They were always thrilled, however, to discover her work and to consider its connections to the work of other authors we would read in these classes. Everyone from Harriet Jacobs and Zora Neale Hurston to William Faulkner and Maxine Hahn Kingston. But by the 1990s, how the world had changed. Instead of being introduced to her work in my classes, students arrived in my courses having read at least one of Morrison's novels before. Some had been introduced to The Bluest Eye, Sula, or Song of Solomon, or Beloved in high school, and then had picked up others of her novels on their own. Others had been introduced to her work in college, in courses that ranged from literature, history, anthropology, American studies, gender studies, Black studies, philosophy. This shift is not surprising, since by the 1990s, Morrison had begun to win what would become a remarkable number of prizes and awards, culminating in the 1993 Nobel Prize in Literature, as Elizabeth just mentioned. By then, her work was held in extraordinarily high regard, both in the US and internationally. Her work has been translated into many languages and is the subject of courses taught and books and articles written by scholars all across the globe. Furthermore, her work speaks to academic and mass readers alike. Scholars have interpreted her work from myriad perspectives, and 4 of her novels were Oprah's Book Club selections. Now, by the early 2000s, I began teaching seminars that focused on Morrison's work alone. By then, she had published more than enough novels, essays, and work in other genres to sustain a semester-long course. I relished the opportunity to read her writing in conversation with itself, to think together with students about what her novels, essays, short fiction had to say to each other. Similarly, students were drawn to these classes because they provided them with an opportunity to immerse themselves in all of her novels, to explore a selection of her insightful and elegant essays, to read some of her books for children, and to study various approaches that professional critics and theorists had taken to her work. I want to share one story with you from my experience of teaching Morrison's work at Princeton in the early 2000s. That semester, after Morrison had entered the process of early retirement, I taught a seminar on her writing. And as it happened, she was on campus a couple of days a week that term. So my students asked me if I would invite her to visit our seminar. So you could imagine I was reluctant to impose upon her goodwill, but when I invited her to join us, she happily agreed to do so. So the plan was she would arrive about a half an hour into our 3-hour seminar and stay as long as she wanted to. So the students were beyond thrilled. And as we prepared for her visit, I asked them to come in prepared with questions for her. And I said, let's just, you asked for this, she's coming. Okay, be prepared. You can't sit here shell-shocked and not say anything. Okay, starstruck and not say anything. But she arrived. They were so starstruck, they didn't say anything. So she talked for a while, though, about her writing process or something, I don't know. And then they relaxed, and then they just began to pepper her with all the questions they had been contemplating throughout the semester. And then at the end of the session, the dynamic was so funny. It was almost parental that, several of them gave me this look and then they said, would you sign our books? And she said, I'll sign your books. I'm not going to personalize every one, but I will sign your books. And then they gave me the smirk, see, we knew she would do it. She did. And they were just over the moon. And even all these years later, students from that seminar remind me of the class that Morrison visited and describe it as one of the most memorable moments of their college experience. So I never actually had the opportunity to watch Morrison teach a full semester-long class, but in that seminar, I could see why she had the reputation of being a superb teacher at Howard, at Yale, at Princeton. She was known for being an extraordinarily gifted teacher. She was known for bringing her meticulous preparation, her profound learning, her preternatural eloquence, her quick wit, her extraordinary critical insight, the very qualities we associate with her writing, as well as her keen emotional intelligence to her teaching. All of that was on view that day in my classroom. In the summer of 2019, after she passed away, like so many others, I was shocked and profoundly saddened by this loss, one that was at once personal, cultural, and global. Like many of my colleagues around the country, I received numerous notes from former students who had studied Morrison's work in my classes. Some were notes of condolence, but several others were thank you notes, messages that helped me understand that her magisterial, challenging, beautifully written, politically astute writing had helped me create a community of readers whenever I taught her work. And I want to share one of these messages with you. Dear President Smith, you were among the first people I thought about today when I heard of the passing of your dear friend, colleague, and inspiration. I am so grateful to you for helping expand my love of Toni Morrison through your brilliant critical work. As I grieve and look through my precious books, I see your name several times introducing and explicating things that have become an invaluable part of who I am. You helped me read Toni's work better, which is to say, you helped me read better. Thank you, and my most earnest prayers are with you today. And, there's more to say about that, but I wanted to sort of say a little bit about that because Morrison was so many things. I mean, she's this extraordinary novelist, but she was also a profoundly committed teacher. And I think as you engage in this big read together, thinking about her work together, I just sort of want you to be aware of the shared, and I'll say more about this at the end of my remarks, the shared project of reading together, how we learn, how we teach each other through that process. Toni Morrison ranks among the most versatile, highly regarded, widely read fiction writers and cultural critics in the history of American letters. She was a novelist, editor, playwright, essayist, librettist, and children's book author. And as I mentioned earlier, she won innumerable prizes and awards, and her work enjoys extraordinarily high regard both in the United States and internationally. Her work has been translated into many languages, including German, Spanish, French, Italian, Norwegian, Finnish, Japanese, and Chinese. Now, because of her broad appeal, readers and critics have often sought to praise her work by calling it universal. The adjective universal has typically been used to describe work that the critic, viewer, reader believes will speak to readers, viewers, or audience members, whatever their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, background. Art described as universal is often contrasted with work that is labeled provincial, that is more explicitly grounded in the culture, lore, or vernacular of an identifiable group. But for all of its universality, Morrison's writing is famously steeped in the nuances of African-American language, music, everyday life, and cultural history. Most of her novels are concerned with the impact of racial patriarchy upon the lives of Black people during specific periods in American history, such as the colonial period, or the eras of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights. I have been drawn to her work by the way in which, again and again, she helps us understand the impact of social, historical, and cultural practices and processes on individual, personal Black lives and on intimate relationships. So her work manages with extraordinary deftness to make us aware of the sort of broad sweep of historical processes, but then how those processes affect, shape, traumatize, in many instances, the lives of individual people who would often go unremarked, and on the relationships they have with each other. So it should not surprise us that Morrison considered this term universal as a descriptor of her work to be a dubious distinction. In a 1981 interview, she observed, and I quote, "It is that business of being universal, a word hopelessly stripped of meaning for me. Faulkner wrote what I suppose could be called regional literature and had it published all over the world. It is good and universal because it is specifically about a particular world. If I tried to write a universal novel, it would be water." Here, Morrison famously challenges the notion that in order to have universal appeal, art must lack markers of cultural specificity. Instead, she argues that only by being specific can a work be truly universal. Rather than aspiring to a culturally deracinated style of writing then, in her fiction, she found ways of writing about race without reproducing the language of racism. Or as she puts it in a 1997 essay called Home, how to be both free and situated, how to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home. How to be both free and situated, how to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home. Many critics have observed that one way to understand Morrison's career is to consider the interconnections, among her roles as writer of fiction and nonfiction, editor and teacher. On numerous occasions, she has herself eschewed the distinction between scholarship and criticism on the one hand and the creative arts on the other. In a 2005 essay, she wrote, and I quote, "It is short-sighted to relegate the practice of creative arts in the academy to the status of servant to its scholarship, to leave the practice of creative arts along the edge of the humanities as though it were an afterthought, an aspirin to ease serious pain, or a Punch and Judy show offering comic relief in the midst of tragedy." Thus, all of her novels wed the brilliant yet subtle use of aesthetic techniques with astute analyses of cultural and historical processes. Likewise, her essays combine keen critical insight with the compelling use of narrative and imagery. So we never forget that she is a novelist writing analytic critical prose or a social and cultural critic writing fiction. During her lifetime, as I mentioned, Morrison was a teacher, editor, critic, and fiction writer, often working in two or more of these areas simultaneously. She taught at a number of colleges and universities while writing fiction, and she published 5 novels during the period when she both worked as a senior editor at Random House and taught. As she continued to produce novels, she also wrote influential speeches, essays, literary criticism, libretti, children's books, and more. The project of her work outside the realm of fiction writing is tied inextricably to the aims of her fiction itself. To understand the extent of her contributions and achievements, I think it's worthwhile to spend a few moments considering the nature of these connections. Throughout her critical writing, Morrison asserts that the role of the reader must be active, not passive. She suggests that the reader must be actively engaged with the author in a dynamic process, out of which textual meaning derives. In the 1996 speech called The Dancing Mind, this is a speech that she delivered upon the occasion of her receiving the Distinguished Contribution to American Literature Award from the National Book Award Foundation. Morrison writes, and I quote, "Underneath the cut of bright and dazzling cloth, pulsing beneath the jewelry, the life of the book world is quite serious. Its real life is about creating and producing and distributing knowledge, about making it possible for the entitled as well as the dispossessed to experience one's own mind, dancing with another's, about making sure that the environment in which the work is done is welcoming, supportive." Now, in part, the relationship between reader and writer reflects the influence of other forms of cultural production and performance, such as dance, oratory, and jazz upon her work. As she observed in a 1984 essay called Rootedness, The Ancestor as Foundation. In her writing, she seeks to inspire us to respond to a written text as if we were in a worship service or in a musical performance. She says, literature should try deliberately to make you stand up and make you feel something profoundly in the same way that a Black preacher requires his congregation to speak, to join him in the sermon that is being delivered in the same way that a musician's music is enhanced when there is a response from the audience. Now, in a book, which closes after all, it's of some importance to me to try to make that connection, to try to make that happen also. And having at my disposal only the letters of the alphabet and some punctuation, I have to provide the places and spaces so that the reader can participate, because it is the affective and participatory relationship between the artist or the speaker and the audience that is of primary importance, as it is in these other art forms I have described. This quality of engagement is also important to her work because it is one way by which she dismantles the hierarchies that support systemic forms of oppression. For Morrison, language is not peripheral to systems of domination. Rather, language is a central means by which racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of oppression are maintained, reproduced, and transmitted. As a writer, she was not in a position to make direct interventions in the social or public policy arenas, but she sought to use her artistic talents to illuminate and transform the ways in which certain practices enshrine culture structures of inequality. As she put it, eliminating the potency of racist constructs in language is the work I can do. So for this reason, Morrison does not spoon feed meaning to her readers. We have to be willing to reread, to work, as she once observed about her novels, but she excluded Sula from this generalization. She said her work refuses the presentation, refuses the seductive safe harbor, the line of demarcation between the sacred and the obscene, public and private, them and us. Refuses, in effect, to cater to the diminished expectations of the reader or his or her alarm heightened by the emotional luggage one carries into the Black topic text. She also wrote elsewhere, I want my fiction to urge the reader into active participation in the non-narrative, non-literary experience of the text, which makes it difficult for the reader to confine himself to a cool and distant acceptance of data. I want to subvert the reader's traditional comfort so that they may experience an unorthodox one, that of being in the company of their own solitary imagination. So sort of think about that for a moment, the traditional comfort of our own minds, as opposed to being in the uncomfortable company of our own solitary imagination. It's an interesting juxtaposition. So the opening of Beloved, I think, is a case in point. I don't know about your experiences, but I recall my own first attempts at reading the novel. I remember the first time I picked it up, I was on a plane, and I thought, okay, great, I'm on a plane and I could just sort of start reading this. And I started reading and I thought, what? And so I found something else to read, okay? And then I picked it up probably 3 or 4 other times, and I just could not get with it, you know? It took a while until I was in the right emotional and intellectual position to open myself up to enter the world of the novel. And then I was in and I couldn't let it go. And I've noticed this with other Morrison novels. You have got to be patient, right? I don't know if others of you have had this experience, especially in the beginning. You have to be in a place to go with her, right? And it's an interesting kind of experience of a kind of surrender. So here's how Beloved begins. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way. But by 1873, Setha and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it, that was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettle full of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor, soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorsill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months even, when nothing was disturbed. No. Each one fled at once, the moment the house committed what was for him the one insult not to be borne or witnessed a second time. Within 2 months, in the dead of winter, leaving their grandmother, baby Suggs, Setha, their mother, and their little sister Denver, all by themselves in the gray and white house on Bluestone Road. It didn't have a number then, because Cincinnati didn't stretch that far. In fact, Ohio had been calling itself a state only 70 years when first one brother and then the next stuffed quilt packing into his hat, snatched up his shoes, and crept away from the lively spite the house felt for them. Okay, so you can kind of see why I would think, what? And even now when I read it, I chuckle to myself because I can see all of the places of mystery, I guess, in that paragraph, and the fact that she's inviting us into a process of understanding that only unfolds over time. So 124, the first characters in that paragraph refers, of course, to 124 Bluestone Road, the house that Setha, a former slave, shares with her daughter, Denver, and the ghost of her other daughter, the, quote, crawling already child she killed. Another thing, this principal character's name is Setha. But when you are first reading it, you don't know, I didn't even know how to pronounce the name. So I'm thinking, what is this, what is this word? What is it? Seethe? Is it, like what? Okay. Number 124 had also been home also to baby Suggs, the mother of Setha's husband, Hallie, lost and presumed dead, and to Howard and Bugler, Setha's two sons. But baby Suggs has died, and fed up with the baby ghost, the two boys have run away as well. By beginning this novel with a sequence of numbers, I think Morrison recognizes that she risks discomfiting readers who will not know what these numbers are meant to refer to. But she has written that she opens in this way for a variety of reasons that are crucial to the meaning of the text as a whole. First, this opening focuses our attention on the house, and it gives the house an identity and a set of characteristics. Spiteful, for example, beginning with this powerful image underscores the significance, the meaning of home ownership to those who were themselves once property and who had been denied the right to own property in their former lives. Second, she writes that there is something about numerals that makes them spoken, heard. So opening with numbers establishes the significant role of orality within this work. But perhaps most significantly, this abrupt opening requires us to understand immediately that we are entering a world populated by people who exist in an extended, if not permanent, state of disorientation. As Morrison observes, no native informant here. The reader is snatched, yanked, thrown into an environment completely foreign. And I want it as the first stroke of the shared experience that might be possible between the reader and the novel's population. Snatched, just as the slaves were snatched from one place to another, from any place to another, without preparation and without defense. No lobby, no door, no entrance, a gangplank perhaps, but a very short one. Published in 1987, Beloved is widely considered to be Morrison's greatest literary achievement, one of the most highly acclaimed novels of the 20th century, and a towering contribution to the world of American letters. Winner of the 1988 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, in 2006, it was selected as the best work of American fiction published in the previous 25 years. Focused as it is on the traumatic effects of enslavement, memory and forgetting upon the individual, familial, and collective consciousness of African Americans, it is a novel that expands our understanding of the human consequences of the institution of slavery. But as a novel about enslavement set during the period of Reconstruction, it is not merely a novel about the past, it is also about the persistence of the past into the present. Now, Beloved has been interpreted from a range of cultural perspectives, including feminist, psychoanalytic, neo-Marxist, critical race theory, and on and on. It has been read as a novel about slavery and freedom, a novel about motherhood, about the body, about the word, about history, about memory. The widespread esteem in which this book is held confirms Morrison's assertion that culturally specific narratives can convey universal truths. The novel addresses the impact of the Middle Passage, enslavement, and Reconstruction upon Black bodies and psychological, emotional, and spiritual lives. Yet it also illuminates the central role of the repressed memory of racial violence and its consequences within the broader story of American democracy. With its focus on loss, memory, grief, and healing, the novel tells a story that has resonated with readers across the globe. I'm actually going to repeat here a little bit of what Elizabeth said in her introduction about Morrison's relationship to the text, the story of Margaret Garner, and how this came to be Beloved. So as Elizabeth mentioned, the story of Beloved grew out of a newspaper account Morrison discovered when she was editing the Black Book during her time as senior editor at Random House. As the late esteemed critic Cheryl Wall of Rutgers University wrote, the Black Book, a documentary history of African Americans, has several methodological and theoretical features in common with Beloved. She goes on to say, the Black Book represents a model for reconstructing the past that is topological, interactive, and communal. A fictional reimagining rather than a historical reconstruction, Beloved shares these same qualities. Both challenge conventional historical discourse, both determined to excavate the lives of the anonymous Black folk who have been, quote, disremembered and unaccounted for. Both reflect what Morrison views as the necessity for Black people to find some way to hold on to the useful past without blocking off the possibilities of the future. Previously published in the American Baptist in 1856, the article, A Visit to the Slave Mother Who Killed Her Child, tells the story of Margaret Garner, a fugitive enslaved woman from Kentucky who killed her 2-year-old daughter and attempted to kill her 3 other children to prevent them from being captured and returned to slavery. Margaret Garner, her husband Robert, his parents, and their 4 children ranging in age from 9 months to 6 years, crossed the Ohio River from Kentucky into Cincinnati. But in Cincinnati, a search party captured them. Margaret Garner was caught between the interests of a slave state and a free state. For not only was she subject to prosecution under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, but she also faced murder charges in the state of Ohio. But ultimately, the federal judge who tried her case overruled Ohio's right to prosecute her for murder and upheld the Fugitive Slave Law instead. The family was returned to Kentucky, where their enslavers sold them to a plantation in Mississippi, and Margaret Garner died of typhoid fever in 1858. With its focus on a mother who chooses to kill her child rather than subject her to a life in enslavement, and who subsequently is treated as property within the legal system, the story of Margaret Garner is a deeply personal account that encapsulates the atrocities and political and epistemological paradoxes that underpinned and sustained the system of slavery. So it's not surprising that her story has both lent itself to a wide range of critical approaches and has been translated into a variety of genres. In the 19th century, for example, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the African-American abolitionist, suffragist, writer, teacher, and orator, as well as Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the British Victorian, both wrote poems about Margaret Garner, and her story inspired Thomas Satterwhite Noble's 1867 painting, The Modern Medea. After Beloved was published, Jonathan Demme directed the 1998 film adaptation based on a screenplay by Akosua Busia and Richard LaGravenese and Adam Brooks. Stephen Weisenberger wrote a meticulously researched account of Garner's story and its historical context called Modern Medea. And Morrison, as librettist, collaborated with composer Richard Danielpour on the opera Margaret Garner. And Morrison has said that once she learned the details of Garner's story, she decided not to conduct further research about her. So in other words, once she read this article and learned the sort of basic outline, she decided not to conduct further research about her. As a novelist, she preferred to draw on the resources of her imagination to conjure up the implications, motives, impacts, and reverberations of the episode. She said, I did a lot of research about everything else in the book, about Cincinnati, about abolitionists and the Underground Railroad, but I refused to find out anything else about Margaret Garner. I really wanted to invent her life. I had a few important things: the sex of the children, how many there were, the fact that she succeeded in cutting the throat of one, and that she was about to bash another one's head up against the wall when someone stopped her. But the rest, she said, was novel writing. Like numerous other African-American writers in the second half of the 20th century and now in the early decades of the 21st, here Morrison draws on the freedom denied antebellum writers of slave narratives. She draws on the freedom denied these antecedents to mine the complexity of the experience of enslavement. While the formerly enslaved were constrained by genre conventions when they wrote their own stories, they were constrained by the need to legitimate their humanity and their moral rectitude. Subsequent generations of African-American writers have been free to use their imagination to explore the unacknowledged and elusive effects of this institution upon the enslaved, the enslavers, and their descendants. Moreover, contemporary authors write from a perspective informed and enriched by the study of slave narratives, by the changing historiography of slavery, the complicated history of race and power relations in the US and throughout the world during the 20th century, and the rise of psychoanalysis and other theoretical frameworks. As Morrison has reflected, it's a kind of literary archaeology. On the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork, you journey to a site to see what remains were left behind and to reconstruct the world that those remains imply. The narrative present of Beloved takes place in Cincinnati in 1873, 8 years after the end of the Civil War. Set during Reconstruction, much of the novel looks back upon the period of enslavement. Indeed, by setting the novel during Reconstruction, Morrison invokes the inescapability of slavery for the very name of the period calls to mind the havoc, destruction wrought during both the antebellum period and the Civil War years. The characters have been so profoundly affected by the experience of enslavement that time and space cannot separate them from its horrors or undo its effects. She coins the term rememory, a word that blends remember and memory, and is thus both verb and noun, to capture the persistent presence of the past, a past so vividly alive that it seems to be embodied. As Setha, the protagonist, observes, and I quote, "Someday you be walking down the road and you hear something or see something going on, so clear, and you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a rememory that belongs to somebody else. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies." Now, readers with even a basic knowledge of the institution of slavery in the US are aware of certain fundamental facts. Enslaved persons were counted as their master's property. Their master's property rights trumped any claims enslaved persons may have had over their offspring or other family members. They were not citizens, and for the purposes of representation were considered 3/5 human. They possessed no rights that white citizens were bound to respect, and thus could not own property, marry, or bear arms. They were forbidden to learn to read and write, and since they had no access to the rule of law, they could be whipped, raped, and otherwise abused with impunity. Now, some of us may assume that such a litany of atrocities captures the horrors of the institution of slavery, but Morrison disabuses us of that notion. And indeed, here is where the power of art makes itself felt. Rather than merely rehearsing the facts, she guides her readers into her characters' inner lives in order to enhance our understanding of the experience of enslavement and its traumatic after effects. The language of the novel both mines the depths of her characters' grief and losses and confronts the limits of language to express traumatic suffering. So she's using language to both mine the depths of their suffering and confronting the limits of language to express trauma. As she remarks in an interview, "I wanted it to be truly felt. I wanted to translate the historical into the personal. I spent a long time trying to figure out what it was about slavery that made it so repugnant, so personal, so indifferent, so intimate, and yet so public." In an essay entitled "Unspeakable Things Unspoken," Morrison addresses the paradox artists face when seeking to represent traumatic experience. She observes the following: "It seemed important to me that the action in Beloved, the fact of infanticide, be immediately known but deferred, unseen. I wanted to give the reader all the information and the consequences surrounding the act, while avoiding engorging myself or the reader with the violence itself. I thought that the act itself had to be not only buried, but also understated, because if the language was going to compete with the violence itself, it would be obscene or pornographic." This observation from Morrison's critical writing about her own novel raises important questions about the ethics of explicit description and the appropriate way of articulating unspeakable suffering. It asks us to consider how an artist speaks for the suffering of those who left no records or, at best, insufficient ones. What discursive forms give voice to the body in pain? The figure of Beloved herself most obviously calls into question the relationship between narrative and the body. As a ghost made flesh, she is the story of the past embodied. Setha, Denver, and Paul D. encounter not only the story of her sorrow and theirs, they engage with its incarnation. The very name Beloved challenges a number of oppositions. Simultaneously, adjective and noun, the word troubles the distinction between the characteristics of a thing and the thing itself. To the extent that the title of the book is an unaccompanied modifier, it calls our attention to the absence of the thing or person being modified. Additionally, the word beloved names more than the baby girl returned. In a funeral service, the word addresses those who mourn the dead. So the word beloved both names that which is past and that which is present. She is who is absent and those who remain behind. Indeed, the word beloved even calls attention to the space between written and oral. Until readers know the context from which her name comes, we don't know how to pronounce that name either. Is it 3 syllables? Is it 2? In the terms the novel offers, beloved might be seen as an example of what Setha calls rememory, something that is gone, yet remains a physical presence. So I want to commend you for your selection of Toni Morrison's Beloved as this year's big read. At a time when our shared experience of democracy is threatened by partisan divisions, suspicion, and fear, collective engagement with a work of literature or some other form of artistic expression can help to bridge our differences. A novel as complex, as big even, as Beloved rewards multiple rereadings and extensive discussion, and it hones our skills of close reading and critical analysis. By taking us so deeply into a world far removed from all of us, it encourages our capacity for empathy. I hope that through this process of shared reading and the series of conversations and presentations, you will gain keen insights into the novel, and that your understanding of this book about the period of slavery and Reconstruction will lead you to think more deeply about our own time. Thank you. I am happy to, yes. And Elizabeth, you'll take the mic around so
I'll run
everybody
around.
can hear? Okay, thank you. Here's one here. Just 1 second, while she brings it.
I have not read the book, so take that as a given. So what you said about the book is what I know about it. The way you describe her writing method, how could her writing method be applied today by people who write for the left or the right? Right now, each writes from their own biases, own narrow perspectives, and refuses to recognize that the other side has a point of view which has, up to a point at least, probably has some validity.
Thank you for the question. And I mean, you could see in a way that I was sort of gesturing toward that issue in my final paragraph. So there are a couple of things. I mean, yes, we do find ourselves confronted by this kind of polarization throughout much of American culture now. And I do think this is a serious issue, but I don't want to generalize and say, I mean, that's all there is, right? Because there are many people working in many different genres in different parts of the country trying to figure out how we bridge our differences. Personally, I think I was thinking about this a lot as I was sort of wrapping up. I do believe that works of artistic production, let me back up and say this. I think that shared projects, shared enterprises can help us bridge our differences, okay? One example of that is a shared experience of works of literature and other forms of artistic production. Being in conversation with each other afterward so that we learn to sit with differing opinions. We learn to ask people how they came to that viewpoint, right? And so I think this is part of what Morrison is asking of us as readers, is that we ask probing questions of the text itself, of each other, that recognizing that reading is work. It is not a passive activity. So I think that is part of what she's asking of us. I would dare say demanding of us. And I think part of what we need to do is rise to the occasion. So what I was thinking, Elizabeth, at the end of my remarks is that this is an important part of the role of public institutions like libraries, right? And when I think about the assault on our democracy, democratic institutions in many directions, but I think about the assault on public spaces, public cultural entities. The fact that libraries make access to books and other kinds of cultural materials free, that they create spaces where people can come together who would not ordinarily find themselves together, that you're creating opportunities for people to discuss another entity, some other work of art, and stay in sustained conversation. I think that I see that as one path, right? I think we have to try various ways of entering into community, into conversation with each other, and staying in it when it gets difficult. Recognizing we will not all agree on everything, but if we stay in it, we may be able to find places of common ground. So that's, but I do think the fact that Morrison is not giving us easy work to read. We have to work, and it helps so much to talk about it and really wrestle with the language and figure out what is she doing? What is she asking us to think about? I think that's a really important dimension of sustaining our culture. There's a question over here, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
This is a question, not just about this book, but about Toni Morrison in general. I had heard somewhere that her books years ago were banned from school reading lists. And that was always, I guess somebody wrote white and whatever, and that they can be enlightening. And also, I think that when Oprah started her book club and they became friends, I think that's when she gained a lot of her popularity, and because she was on the map. I mean, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, so let me start quickly with the second point. I do believe that Oprah's book club did launch her work into the perspective, the awareness of mass readerships. But prior to that, I think within educational institutions, both high schools as well as in colleges. Well, before that, I do believe that her work was already gaining in popularity. And I think among people who were sort of passionate, committed, serious readers, her work was already gaining some popularity. But there's no question that Oprah's book club gave her work a kind of massive visibility. As far as this issue of books being banned, you know, I mean, that's something that I have so much trouble with, I have to say. You know, I grew up in a family where reading was sort of everything. And I had very strict conservative parents, but they always said, read whatever, as long as you're reading, we really don't care what you're reading. They just, and so I think it helped me become something of a discerning reader myself. So it's something that I always feel is largely, I believe in giving people books that stretch them. And I worry about what it is that certain school districts, certain institutions might be afraid of in Morrison's work. Now, I say that I also recognize that her work asks readers to deal with some very difficult material. And some of it may be re-traumatizing for students. And so I think that teachers at all levels need to figure out how to prepare their students for texts in which they will read about incest or rape, where there will be vivid descriptions of murder and this kind of thing, right? I mean, that I do understand and appreciate that, but I worry about censorship that's motivated by a desire to protect students from understanding the complex history of race and racial violence in this country, right? Because I think then we're denying our young people of a fuller and more complex understanding of the history of the country. So, and of the importance of letters, the world of letters in our understanding of that cultural history. I mean, I've had the experience of teaching Morrison to, one quick thing, to very diverse populations of students. And as I said, over time, I was not the first person teaching them Morrison. I mean, they had studied Morrison in high school. They'd read everything themselves. I don't want to protect people from that. I want them to be able to engage in it. So that's one story I wanted to share. The other story I'll share, when I was at Princeton and Toni Morrison was still there, we had, over the course of a few years, some scholars from Japan who were scholars of African-American literature in Japan, who specialized in Morrison's work. And they would come to Princeton to work on their scholarship, right, to take classes and so on. And so one of them invited me to come to, well, actually a couple of them invited me to come over to meet their students in Hiroshima and in Tokyo. And the students were so knowledgeable about Morrison's work. I mean, they were so deeply immersed in it. They had such great questions, right? And it just underscored my colleague said, they had to do a lot of prep to make sure that they understood the broad historical references and so on. But for them, it was enormously eye-opening and meaningful. Why would we want to protect people from that? I just, I find this very puzzling. So anyway, it's probably more than you wanted to hear, but it's a story I wanted to tell. So is there any, before we come back to you, did anybody else have yes, here in the front row? She wants you to use the mic.
I found it very difficult to read, and I tried to talk to people about it and explain why. And it wasn't the reading, it was that I felt I was in their souls. It asked me to participate in their souls and their human essence. And somebody, I guess the woman who introduced her at the Nobel Prize said something about she's not hard to read if you realize it's poetry. So could you speak to that in general in her work?
Well, I mean, she is somebody, I was trying to get at this a little bit, somebody whose work is so profoundly influenced by so many different genres. So you said that if you acknowledge it's poetry, right, it's also music, right? It's also dance. It's also oratory. She loved working collaboratively with artists in other fields. I mean, she loved to immerse herself in music and dance and theater and so on, but she also loved to work collaboratively with them, to bring students together who had a passion for different genres and to help them figure out what they could make. So I think some of it may have to do with the fact that she recognized that so often she was trying to get at something that was really ineffable, and the tools of one genre on its own might not be enough, and that you might need to figure out what else you have that you can bring, right, in order to be able to get at what you're talking about. So I know what you're talking about, though. I have another story I can share. I was at an event last night where we're celebrating someone who had been a student of Morrison's, and somebody was telling a story about trying to read Morrison's novel Jazz and just not being able to get it. And our mutual friend told her at the time, you got to sing it. And then he just got up and started singing it. And she said, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, I get it. So it's interesting how that happens. But I was so sort of intrigued and touched by what you said, that it's hard to read because it's so painful. You're like in these people, in their souls. And then you realize something is happening beyond the level of narrative exposition, deeper than that. It's poetic, and you have to be willing to go there, right? And so, and that's hard. Yeah. I mean, some of these books I've read so often because I've taught or worked so much and written about it and so on. But there are certain moments in certain novels where I just feel physically uncomfortable. I mean, it's like, I get an inadvertent bodily response to, I know what's coming. I don't want to read it. And then others where I find a paragraph or a page, and it's like an old friend. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is this one. Right. And it's a really, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to give yourself fully over to the act of reading in this way. So, and we just, I don't know, so many other things compete with our time these days. We don't get to do I shouldn't speak for anybody else. I don't get to do as much of that as I would like. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask her for the mic. So the question was, what would I recommend that you read next? Wow. Well, I mean, there is something wonderful about the first three novels. I would, if I were you, I might go to those first. The Bluest Eye, Sula, and Song of Solomon. And then I think, and then you would, then I would say, just see what strikes you. But I also, one of the last, her penultimate novel, A Mercy, I think is a jewel of a book. I think it's a mercy. I think it's a jewel of a book, I think. So, but jazz is very painful. I think it's very painful, but it's really gorgeous. So I think there are a couple of questions. Actually, I'm sorry. There are a couple of hands over there.
Question on Zoom, actually.
I'm sorry.
This is a question from one of the people who are on the Zoom call. It says, I originally read Beloved in college in the late 80s. I too had never heard of Morrison when this novel was assigned. I read it again around the time of the Nobel Prize. I'm now reading it for the third time, and my reading experience is so much more profound. How many times have you reread Beloved? And can you comment on how each reading experience differs and how different your takeaways are after each reading?
Okay, no, no, and no. I mean, no. So in other words, I cannot tell you how many times I've reread this book for a couple of reasons. One, because I've written about it, so that would have involved reading it over and over again. And then I've taught it so many times. And then I think once or twice I just picked it up because I missed it. So I can't tell you. And I completely agree with what the questioner said about how you pick up these books and you see something different all the time. So I do, I mean, I think I can't enumerate across the board, but I do know that there are times when I've read the book and I've really focused on Setha a lot. There are times when I read it and I find myself thinking about Denver, the surviving daughter, and what it takes for her to kind of allow herself to reenter a community and be rescued and help to rescue her family. I think a lot about that. There are times when I am just, I don't know, moved practically to tears by the story of Paul D and the torment that he endured. So different characters, different moments will seize me and sort of hold me like that. And then I think for a number of years, I was really captivated by the character of Baby Suggs. So there's a scene of Baby Suggs. She is Setha's mother-in-law, the mother of her late husband, Hallie, who is sort of, I think she's referred to in the novel as an unchurched preacher. And she sort of brings members of the community together in a clearing. And there's a sort of it's almost like a sermonic passage. And I find that deeply moving. And from time to time, I just go back and savor that. So different, and this happens to me with so many of her novels, I mean, it's not just this one, but especially this one, I would say. So I'm sorry, I think what we're trying to do is let everybody get, okay, got it. Okay, right. Okay.
Thank you so much. I read Toni Morrison maybe a very long time ago. And I think I just read her as I would any other novelist. So I really didn't know what I was getting into. And the reason
Want to hold the mic up? Sorry.
is that better? Okay. The reason I started reading her is because I met her because I was working at the school that her sons attended. And I just remember when meeting her, and believe me, it was an encounter. I'm not saying that I was her best friend or anything like that. I just remember being so struck by her ability, it seemed to me, to just read people, and she had this way of being kind of amused by people. Yeah. And I was just wondering how she was able to evoke that if she herself had encountered racism during her life, or how she was able to even speak the way, for instance, Sethe speaks. How did she learn about that language, and what happened in her life maybe that made her able to speak as these people spoke? I also remember, even though I didn't understand very much, that it was probably the first book that I had ever read, and I read Song of Solomon and The Bluest Eye, where, like you said, you just don't sit there and read the book. I would read a paragraph and I would sit there for about half an hour thinking about it. And over the years, I kind of lost touch with Toni Morrison, you might say, but I'm really so glad, because I have begun reading Beloved. I'm up to the part where Paul D comes into the picture. And I'm always moved by the way she uses the supernatural in her stories. I don't always understand it. And I would love to know where where I can learn more about Toni Morrison, maybe through seminars or listening to people like you.
I mean, there is so much written about her out there. So there's, a lot to immerse yourself in. I mean, so one thing I will say, it's interesting. I read that passage where Morrison said that she did research and then she stopped because she really wanted to imagine herself into the Sethas in her life. But Morrison was an extraordinarily intellectually curious person. She was amazingly well-read. She loved all kinds of music. I mean, she was I was trying to get at this a little bit, but, she was an extraordinarily gifted sort of scholar, as well as a stunning creative force, right? So she put an enormous amount of work of all kinds into and behind everything she wrote, right? But I just also think she was so curious about everything she did. And I know that, Elizabeth, I saw in the brochure that you have a notice in here about this documentary, Toni Morrison, The Pieces That I Am. It is really worth, if you haven't seen it, it's really worth seeing, because one of the things that it shows you, I think, is how she was able to learn so much from everything she did. So I talked about, for example, the fact that she was a teacher and an editor and a writer and a poet, and all of these different things. But she was also a mother, right? She was and so I'm so glad you mentioned her sons. And she was very, she cared really deeply about mothering her sons well, even as she was doing all those other things. But she was also paying close attention to that experience. She was a loving, devoted daughter. She was, she paid really close attention from childhood onward to the worlds in which she moved, to the ways people spoke, to food ways, to the way people kept their home, to the creative expression that people exhibited outside of traditional genres. I mean, she was just extraordinarily observant. And so in a way, I think once you are aware of how deeply and richly and complexly she lived, it doesn't surprise one that she was drawing from such an extraordinary range of resources to capture voices, to capture appearance, to capture gait. So I would say this is all the product of an extraordinary mind and profound intellectual curiosity. You had your hand up over here, Elizabeth. I'm giving you your steps and working out over here.
I'm grateful for this evening, first of all, but I'd like to say that and I'm saying this sort of tongue in cheek, I met Toni Morrison when I read Sula. That was an assignment and as an undergrad in social work school to read that book. And it had such an impact on me. And I read it and I didn't quite understand, but I had a paper due, so I knew I had to read it. And it was so deep. And it reminded me so much of things that were happening to people in my neighborhood when I was growing up, the secrets that were kept, the people who were trying to save other people in the neighborhood because that's what happened. But it also reminded me of the fact that in Boston, we used to have what was called the bookmobile that would come to each neighborhood every week. And I always liked to read. So when I would go to the bookmobile, I would get books that I ran out of the young adult books and the children's books. So I just started in the next group of books. And the lady at the desk said, you have to let your parents know what you're reading. I had gotten The Foxes of Harrow. So by Frank Yerby. So she said, you have to let your parents know. So I told my mother I was reading The Foxes of Harrow by Frank Yerby. She said, who's that? I said, I don't know. Actually grew up in the next town from us, but we had never heard of him. So reading Toni Morrison's books reminded me of those demure children that sit and listen to adult stories and who talk about things, who do things. I wanted to know if my mother really believed in ghosts. So she was visiting a friend and I was going to leave, and my cousin was with me. We pretended we left and we ran into a room that was just off the room where she was seated and talking. And we kept knocking on the door and running back. And finally, we just finally came out and said, that was us, ha, ha, ha. And it wasn't such a ha, 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 ha to them, but Toni Morrison is able to take something like that and weave it into a story that would have mystery to it, would have intent to it, would have, so you learn those things. You learn certain things that you don't know you learn. And if you're a writer and as creative as she was, she could weave it into a story of intense mystery, curiosity, love, whatever it was that she was writing about. And I think that that was her magic. That was really her magic. And every book I could get of hers, I read it. And Beloved truly was difficult. I think I only read it once, but I'm going to go back and read it again. Thank you.
And thank you for mentioning the power of overhearing, right? Because I think I've read somewhere where I'm sure I heard her or read her talk about being a child who was overhearing the grown folks, right? And it's a way of capturing wisdom and insight that's beyond what you're hearing, right? And it's a way of understanding meaning, again, through tone. You don't have to know what the words are, or you don't have to understand what the words are, but you know it's something that they don't necessarily want you to hear. I'm thinking about, that moment in The Bluest Eye when she talks about Claudia, overhearing the grown folks, and there's something about the lives of the adults that the kids have a window in, and they don't quite understand it, but it's part of what makes them feel safe, is being able to hear and overhear, and then gradually come into knowledge and understanding. And I think there is a way in which we are invited into her books as overhearers as well. And it takes time for us to situate ourselves, figure, okay, who's this character? Who's that? What are they actually talking about? What's the tone? It's very, very interesting, very helpful for you to reference that. So thank you.
Mention that she was very spiritual to me. I saw her as a spiritual person. I was introduced to her when I was probably about 12 years old. And I just always read her books, and I shared them with my friends. And I just have always had a love thing with her my whole entire life. And I guess it's because my mom met her first. But in Pieces That I Am, I also felt like she told us a little bit. She gave us, I just can't get over what a gift that was to us. I went to see the film at Lincoln Center just like a week or two before she left us. And I tried to get 2 girlfriends to go with me. Nobody would go, so I went by myself. And after seeing that, it gave me so much insight into who she was as a person. I had read the Black Book, and I didn't realize I had copies I had given away to other people, but I never realized that it was her who had put that together, that she had been involved with that. And just when she talked about her experience with ghosts, her experience with spiritual things, I just thought that was so interesting. I just thought everything about her was interesting. And it was amazing to me that I just got to have that experience with her that one last time before she left us.
And I'm just so glad that I did. And it's available to all of us. And so we can see it over and over again. It was a blessing. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
So I want to thank you, Dr. Smith, for this wonderful presentation. It really sort of opened our eyes a lot more to Toni Morrison and the book. I think that if you haven't read it, I think this is the time. We have, like I said earlier, we have several events that help us understand the book a little bit more. For those of us that want to read and discuss Beloved, we have a book discussion here next week on Tuesday. We have a book discussion at Mill River Park if you want to be outside on Friday at 11. There's also a discussion at the Harry Bennett branch as well as South End. But in addition to that, we're going to be looking at sort of the trauma that we see in Beloved. And also we're going to have a presentation on the Gothic elements that we see in Beloved. So there's a lot of wonderful things coming up, and it's a really great way for us to delve and immerse ourselves into Beloved. So please take part of this and be here for it.
Thank you all so much again for being here this evening. Thank you.